Some people believe the ocean only takes. But the old fishermen of Stormhaven whispered something different. They said the sea remembers every kindness ever given to it, and one day, when the tide is ready, it gives something back. The harbor of Stormhaven groaned beneath the weight of the storm as midnight fog rolled across the docks like drifting smoke from another world. Rain hammered the weathered planks in silver sheets, and the Atlantic beyond the breakwater churned black beneath flashes of distant lightning. Old lobster boats knocked softly against their moorings while rusted bells hanging from the pier chains rang with hollow, lonely voices carried by the wind. Ethan Calloway pulled the collar of his faded canvas coat tighter against the cold as he stood beside his battered Ford pickup near the edge of Pier 9. At 40 years old, Ethan carried the quiet posture of a man who had spent too many years listening for danger. His broad shoulders still held the strength of his Army engineering days, but time and grief had worn the sharp edges into something quieter now, something tired. Rain slid through the streaks of silver beginning to creep into his dark brown hair, and the pale harbor lights reflected dimly in his steel-gray eyes. Beside him stood Briggs, the 6-year-old German shepherd who had followed Ethan through more winters than either of them cared to count. The dog's thick silver and cream coat shimmered beneath the rainwater, ears standing high against the wind as his amber eyes scanned the darkness beyond the docks. Briggs had once worked military search and rescue overseas, trained to detect things no human senses could reach in time. Even now, years later, Ethan trusted the dog's instincts more than he trusted his own thoughts. The storm should have driven every boat back to shore hours ago, yet Briggs would not stop staring toward the sea. He stood frozen near the edge of the pier, muscles tense beneath his harness, nostrils flaring against the cold salt air. Ethan noticed it immediately. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly, though the wind nearly swallowed the words whole. Briggs did not look back. Somewhere beyond the fog, hidden beneath the black waves and rain, a faint light rocked against the horizon. Ethan narrowed his eyes. At first it looked like nothing more than another buoy lantern tossed by the storm, but then the light tilted sharply sideways before vanishing behind a wall of rain. Briggs suddenly barked 3 times. Sharp, fast, urgent. The exact signal he used years ago before collapsed buildings gave way overseas. Ethan's stomach tightened. Another flash of lightning cracked across the clouds, illuminating the ocean for half a second. This time Ethan saw it clearly. A small fishing trawler drifted dangerously close to the jagged rocks near the north jetty, its engine dark, its mast leaning at an unnatural angle against the waves. The sea roared louder, smashing white spray against the cliffs. Briggs lunged forward before Ethan could react, claws scraping across the wet wood of the dock. "Easy," Ethan shouted, grabbing the leash as another violent gust tore through the harbor. But Briggs kept pulling toward the storm with desperate determination, low growls rumbling deep in his chest. Then, through the howl of the wind, Ethan heard it. A voice. Weak, distant, barely alive beneath the storm. Someone was out there. Ethan looked again toward the drifting boat as thunder rolled across the water like cannon fire from another lifetime. For one long moment, the harbor seemed to hold its breath. Even the fog felt alive somehow, curling around the docks as if the ocean itself were watching. Briggs barked again, louder this time, and Ethan finally understood. The dog had heard the sea calling long before he did. And somewhere beyond the black waves, something far older than the storm was waiting to rise from the depths. Ethan did not remember deciding to run. One moment he was standing beneath the harbor lights with rain soaking through his coat, and the next he was sprinting across the dock with Briggs pulling ahead through the storm like a creature chasing something only he understood. The wooden planks shuddered beneath their boots and paws as waves exploded against the support beams below, spraying icy seawater through the gaps. Somewhere beyond the fog, the crippled fishing boat drifted closer to the rocks with every swell. The old harbor siren began to moan through the night, low and mournful, as though the sea itself were warning them to turn back. But Briggs never slowed. His ears stayed pinned forward, eyes locked on the darkness ahead. Ethan reached the end of the pier just as another flash of lightning lit the shoreline in silver blue light. The trawler appeared only 50 yards away now, half swallowed by rain and rising waves. Its hull scraped violently against hidden stone, and a single lantern swung from the cabin window in desperate arcs. Then Ethan saw the figure near the stern. An old man clung to the railing with one trembling hand, while the other struggled to hold a loose rope snapping wildly in the wind. His heavy yellow raincoat whipped against the storm like a torn flag. "Hold on," Ethan shouted, though he doubted the man could hear him over the crashing surf. Briggs barked sharply and lunged toward a stack of emergency gear near the harbor shack. Ethan understood immediately. Years of rescue work had trained them both to move without speaking. He grabbed a thick coil of marine rope hanging beside the dock ladder and fastened it around his waist with practiced hands. The cold rain burned against his face as he tied the other end around a steel post secured deep into the pier. Briggs braced beside him automatically, paws planted wide against the slick boards, body tense and ready. Ethan glanced down once at the dog. "Same as before, huh?" Briggs looked back with steady amber eyes that carried memories Ethan sometimes wished he could forget. The ocean roared beneath them. Ethan climbed down the slippery dock supports until freezing seawater crashed against his boots. Every wave struck with enough force to rattle the wooden beams overhead. The fishing trawler drifted dangerously close now, the sound of splintering would echoing through the fog. Ethan reached out and caught the side railing just as another swell shoved the boat sideways. The old fisherman nearly lost his grip. "Easy," Ethan said firmly as he climbed aboard. "I have got you." Up close, the man looked older than Ethan first thought. Late 70s, maybe. More. Deep lines carved through his weather-beaten face, white beard soaked with rainwater, pale blue eyes clouded with exhaustion and cold. Yet there was still something stubborn in them, something that refused to surrender to the storm. "Engine died," the old man rasped. "Current pulled me straight toward the reef." Ethan nodded once and secured the loose safety rope around the man's chest while Briggs barked from the dock above, pacing anxiously against the edge. Another massive wave slammed the trawler hard enough to tilt the deck beneath them. The old fisherman stumbled, but Ethan caught him before he fell. Together, they moved carefully toward the bow while the rain hammered the cabin roof overhead like thrown gravel. Ethan signaled toward the dock. Briggs responded instantly, digging his claws into the wood as tension pulled through the rescue rope. Slowly, inch by inch, man and dog worked together against the storm. Ethan could feel Briggs anchoring them from above with unwavering strength. The old fisherman stared upward through the rain with disbelief written across his face. "That dog," he whispered weakly. Ethan managed the faintest smile despite the freezing wind. "He hears trouble before the world does." By the time they reached the pier ladder, the storm had begun to shift. The rain softened slightly, and somewhere beyond the black horizon, the first distant foghorn echoed across the sea. Briggs pressed close beside the old man the moment his boots touched solid ground again, sniffing carefully at his trembling hands as though confirming he still belonged among the living. The fisherman rested one weathered hand gently against the dog's neck, eyes glistening beneath the harbor lights. Then he looked toward the dark ocean behind them with an expression Ethan could not fully understand. It was not fear. It was recognition, as if the sea had finally decided to return something it had been holding on to for a very long time. The storm finally weakened sometime after 2 in the morning, but the harbor still breathed with the restless rhythm of heavy water striking old wood. Fog drifted low across Stormhaven as Ethan guided his truck through the narrow coastal road that curved above the cliffs. The windshield wipers groaned back and forth while salt rain streaked across the glass in silver lines. Briggs sat upright in the passenger seat, still alert despite the long night, ears twitching whenever thunder rolled faintly out over the Atlantic. In the back seat beneath a wool blanket rested the old fisherman, silent except for the occasional rough cough carried through the dim cabin light. Ethan glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You have family nearby?" he asked quietly. The old man stared out the window toward the dark ocean beyond the trees before answering. "Just the sea." His voice sounded tired, but not bitter, like someone who had spent decades learning how loneliness settles into a man slowly, the same way salt settles into wood. A few minutes later, the truck turned down a gravel lane leading toward the northern edge of town. The cottage appeared through the mist like a forgotten memory clinging to the shoreline. A weather-beaten house stood alone above the rocks with pale yellow light glowing faintly behind lace curtains. Beside it rose an old lighthouse tower long abandoned by the Coast Guard decades earlier, its rusted lantern room silhouetted against the clouds like the skeleton of another age. Ethan parked beside a row of stacked lobster traps, darkened by rain. Briggs jumped down immediately, paws crunching against wet shells scattered along the driveway. The dog stopped near the cliff edge and looked out toward the ocean again, body still tense. The fisherman noticed. "He hears it too," he murmured softly. Ethan frowned slightly. "Here's what." But the old man only opened the truck door and stepped out slowly into the cold wind. Up close, the cottage carried the warm smell of cedar smoke, sea salt, and something faintly sweet drifting from inside, perhaps old tea leaves or weathered pine. Wind chimes made from polished shells rattled softly beneath the porch roof, while waves crashed below the cliffs in slow, hollow booms. The fisherman unlocked the front door with trembling hands. "Come in before the cold settles into your bones," he said. Inside, the cottage felt untouched by time. Amber. Lamplight spilled across dark wooden walls lined with faded nautical charts, old brass compasses, framed black and white photographs, and shelves crowded with books swollen from years of ocean dampness. A cast iron stove crackled softly in the corner, filling the room with warmth that seemed almost unreal after the storm outside. Briggs wandered carefully across the floorboards, nails clicking softly as he sniffed the air. Ethan removed his soaked coat and studied the photographs hanging near the fireplace. Most showed fishing crews standing proudly beside enormous catches decades earlier. Others showed rescue boats, rough seas, and smiling men wearing heavy wool coats beside harbor lanterns. One photograph caught Ethan's attention immediately. A younger version of the fisherman stood beside a large vessel painted with the name Morning Star. The ocean behind them looked calm and endless beneath a pale sunrise. "That was 48 years ago," the old man said quietly from the stove. "Before the sea changed its mind." Ethan turned. The fisherman had already placed a kettle over the fire. His weathered hands moved carefully, but with habit earned from a lifetime alone. "Walter Quinn," he added after a moment. "Seems fair you know the name of the man you dragged out of the Atlantic tonight." Ethan nodded once. "Ethan Calloway." Walter looked down toward Briggs, who now stood motionless near the far corner of the room beside an old wooden cabinet facing the windows. The dog's ears remained sharply forward. A low rumble vibrated softly in his throat. Ethan noticed immediately. Briggs. The dog did not move. Outside, somewhere below the cliffs, a distant buoy bell rang once through the fog. Walter's expression changed the instant he heard it. Not fear. Recognition. Slowly, he crossed the room toward the cabinet Briggs was staring at. Resting on top beneath a layer of dust sat an old brass compass beside a lantern blackened by age and seawater. Walter touched the compass gently with trembling fingers. "That bell only rings when the tide is carrying something home," he whispered. The fire crackled softly behind them while the ocean breathed against the rocks below like a living thing listening from the dark. The wind eased before dawn, leaving the coastline wrapped in a strange stillness that felt heavier than the storm itself. Low gray clouds drifted slowly above the Atlantic while the first weak traces of morning light spread across the horizon like pale silver poured over dark water. Inside the cottage, the fire had burned low, filling the room with the soft scent of cedar ash and warm iron. Ethan sat near the window holding a steaming mug of black coffee between his hands while Briggs rested beside the hearth. Yet, even lying still, the German shepherd never fully relaxed. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward the sea beyond the cliffs, as though listening to a conversation no human could hear. Walter Quinn stood quietly near the stove watching the kettle hum beneath faint ribbons of steam. In daylight he looked even older somehow, like the ocean wind itself had slowly carved pieces away from him over the years. Deep creases lined his face, and his hands carried the roughness of decades spent hauling nets through cold water before sunrise. Yet his pale blue eyes still held something sharp beneath the exhaustion. Something awake. Outside, gulls circled above the rocks crying into the fog. Briggs suddenly lifted his head. A low sound rolled through his chest as he stared toward the windows overlooking the shoreline below. Ethan noticed immediately. "He has been doing that since last night," he said quietly. Walter nodded without surprise. "He hears the tide shifting." Ethan glanced toward the ocean. "The tide sounds the same as every other tide to me." Walter gave a faint smile that carried no humor. That is because the sea speaks differently to some creatures. Silence settled again except for the distant crash of waves below the cliffs. Then Briggs stood abruptly and crossed the room toward the old brass compass resting atop the cabinet. The dog sniffed it carefully before placing one paw against the wood beneath it. His ears stood high, focused. Ethan rose slowly from the chair. Briggs. But the dog remained frozen, staring not at the compass itself, but at the floor beneath the cabinet. Walter's expression shifted. The moment he saw it, his weathered face lost color beneath the firelight. "That is impossible," he whispered. Ethan frowned. "What?" Walter moved carefully across the room and lifted the brass compass into his hands. It was old enough for the metal edges to have softened with age, its glass face scratched by years of salt and storms. Yet the needle inside was spinning slowly in uneven circles. Ethan stared. "Broken?" Walter shook his head once. "No. It only does this when the current changes beneath the cliffs." He looked toward the ocean beyond the windows. "I have not seen it move like this in 30 years. Briggs let out 2 soft whines and scratched the floorboards once. Then again. Ethan crouched beside the cabinet and pressed his hand against the old wood. At first he felt nothing except cold vibrations from the storm outside. But then came a faint sound beneath the floor. Metal. Hollow. Rhythmic. Almost like chains shifting slowly underwater. Ethan looked up sharply. Walter had heard it too. The old fisherman lowered himself into a chair near the fire as though the strength had suddenly left his legs. For a long moment, he simply stared into the flames while dawn light slowly brightened the windows behind him. "The morning star disappeared in October of 1974, he said at last, voice quiet as drifting fog. Officially, they called it a storm accident. The ship vanished less than 3 miles from these cliffs." Ethan remembered the photograph from the wall. "Your boat." Walter nodded slowly. "My father's." The fire cracked softly between them. Outside, the sea rolled against the rocks in slow, heavy breaths. Walter tightened his grip around the compass. People believed the ship carried gold from old wartime accounts. Others said it carried military payroll bonds headed north after the war. Truth is, nobody ever found out because the ocean swallowed everything before sunrise. Briggs suddenly barked once. Sharp. Focused. He turned toward the lighthouse outside and stood rigid near the door. Ethan followed his gaze through the fogged glass. Far above the cliffs, inside the abandoned lantern room of the lighthouse, a faint glow flickered once. Through the morning mist before vanishing again. Walter stared toward it with widening eyes. "That light has not worked since 1982, he whispered. Then the buoy bell out at sea rang 3 slow times through the fog, and somewhere deep beneath the cottage floorboards came the sound of something heavy shifting far below the cliffs, as if the ocean itself had finally begun to wake. The fog lingered over Stormhaven long after sunrise, draping the cliffs and harbor in a cold silver haze that blurred the line between sea and sky. Ethan stood outside the cottage with a steaming enamel mug warming his hands while Briggs paced slowly along the edge of the bluff above the crashing surf. The Atlantic below no longer sounded violent like it had during the storm. Instead, it breathed with a deep, steady rhythm, heavy waves rolling against the rocks as though the ocean itself had settled into thought. Far out beyond the mist, fishing horns echoed faintly through the morning. Briggs suddenly stopped near the old lighthouse path. His ears lifted high toward the cliffs, body stiff with attention. Ethan followed him through wet grass glittering with rainwater. The abandoned lighthouse tower rose above them like a forgotten guardian of the coast, its white paint peeling beneath decades of salt wind and storms. Rust streaked down the metal railing spiraling toward the lantern room overhead, and broken windows rattled softly whenever the breeze shifted from the sea. Briggs circled near the base of the tower, nose low against the ground. Then he barked once and pawed at something buried beneath tangled beach grass beside the stone foundation. Ethan knelt carefully and brushed away damp sand with his hands. Metal glinted beneath the dirt. A small iron lockbox emerged slowly from the earth, its surface darkened by rust and years of ocean air. Walter approached behind them carrying the old brass compass tightly against his chest. The moment he saw the box, the color drained from his face. "Dear God," he whispered. Ethan looked up. "You know what this is?" Walter lowered himself carefully onto a nearby stone bench overlooking the sea. Wind pulled through his white hair while gulls wheeled overhead beneath the pale clouds. For several moments, he simply stared at the box without touching it, as though afraid the past itself might break open beside him. Finally, he nodded slowly. My father buried this the week before the morning star disappeared. Ethan opened the corroded latch carefully. Inside rested a waterproof oilskin pouch tied with faded navy cord. Briggs sat beside Ethan in complete silence, amber eyes fixed on the contents as if he already understood their importance. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he untied the cord. Inside lay an old folded chart stained by seawater and age. Beside it rested a silver pocket watch frozen at exactly 2:17 in the morning. Ethan immediately recognized the same hour marked on the clock hanging inside Walter's cottage. Walter swallowed hard. That was the exact minute the distress signal vanished. The wind strengthened around the tower, carrying the sharp scent of salt and cold stone. Ethan unfolded the chart across his knee. Most of the markings had faded, but one section remained circled in dark red ink roughly half a mile north of the cliffs beneath a place labeled Widow's Reef. Near the edge of the chart, written in uneven handwriting, were 4 words. When the tide retreats, follow. Ethan frowned slightly. Your father wrote this? Walter nodded once. He always believed the sea gave warnings before it returned something lost. Briggs suddenly stood and looked toward the ocean below. A low rumble rolled through his chest. Ethan followed his gaze. The tide had begun pulling farther away from the rocks than normal, exposing long black stretches of reef, usually hidden beneath water. White foam curled through narrow channels carved deep into the stone. Walter stared toward the exposed reef with widening eyes. That should not happen until tonight, he whispered. Then another sound drifted upward from below the cliffs. Not thunder, not waves. Metal striking stone somewhere beneath the waterline. Slow, hollow, rhythmic. Briggs barked sharply and started down the narrow lighthouse trail before Ethan could react. Ethan grabbed the chart quickly while Walter rose unsteadily beside him. Together they followed the dog toward the descending fog. As they moved closer to the shoreline, the sound grew clearer beneath the crashing surf. Chains. Something massive shifting below the retreating tide. And for the first time in nearly 50 years, the ocean was beginning to reveal where it had hidden the morning star. The path descending from the lighthouse wound sharply along the cliffs, slick with rain and tangled roots twisting through wet stone. Fog pressed close around Ethan, Walter, and Briggs as they followed the narrow trail toward the exposed reef below. The ocean air smelled heavier now, thick with salt, seaweed, and something older rising from beneath the retreating tide. Briggs moved several feet ahead, muscles tense beneath his damp fur, stopping every few moments to listen toward the crashing surf. The strange metallic sound continued below them. Hollow, rhythmic, like chains dragged slowly across stone deep under the water. Ethan tightened his grip on the folded chart tucked beneath his coat. You ever come down here before? He asked quietly. Walter nodded once while carefully steadying himself along the rocks. Not since the winter after the wreck. His pale eyes remained fixed ahead through the fog. People stopped searching after they found nothing. But my father always said the sea hides things until the right tide arrives. The cliffs opened suddenly onto a stretch of jagged black reef glistening beneath the gray morning sky. Water rushed through narrow channels carved deep into the stone, swirling around barnacle-covered outcroppings exposed farther than any normal low tide should allow. Ethan stopped in disbelief. Nearly 50 yards of ocean floor lay uncovered before them, scattered with tangled driftwood, rusted lobster cages, and smooth stones shining beneath seawater. Briggs barked sharply from farther ahead near the base of the cliffs. The German shepherd stood beside a narrow opening half concealed by hanging curtains of seaweed and jagged rock. White foam surged around the entrance before draining back again into the sea. Walter's breathing slowed. That cave was never visible before, he whispered. Ethan glanced toward the sky. The clouds above Stormhaven churned slowly in widening circles while gulls wheeled silently overhead as if avoiding the shoreline entirely. Another deep metallic groan echoed from inside the hidden opening. Briggs stepped forward without hesitation and disappeared into the misty darkness beneath the cliff. Briggs. Ethan moved quickly after him, ducking beneath the low rock ceiling as freezing seawater rushed around his boots. Inside, The cave stretched farther than expected. Dim gray light filtered through cracks above, illuminating walls slick with moisture and mineral veins glimmering faintly beneath the stone. The air smelled ancient. Salt, iron, wet timber. Somewhere deeper inside came the steady dripping of water echoing through darkness. Briggs waded ahead beside a jagged bend in the cavern, ears pinned forward towards something hidden farther below. Ethan switched on a small flashlight from his coat pocket. The beam swept across the cave walls before freezing on something massive lodged between the rocks ahead. Weathered wooden beams emerged slowly from the darkness, blackened by seawater and time. Rusted iron braces clung to splintered planks coated in barnacles thicker than a man's hand. Walter stopped breathing for a moment beside him. "Morning Star," he whispered. Half the ship remained trapped within the cavern itself, as though the ocean had carefully hidden it away from the world for decades. The vessel rested at an unnatural angle between collapsed rock formations, preserved by cold water and darkness. A faded section of lettering still remained visible beneath layers of salt and age. Ethan stepped closer, boots crunching against broken shells and drifted sand. Briggs moved carefully toward the center of the wreck before suddenly stopping beside a corroded steel hatch half buried beneath debris. The dog let out a low rumble deep in his chest. Ethan aimed the flashlight downward. Thick chains stretched from the hatch into darkness below the ship, disappearing beneath layers of rock and seawater. Another metallic groan rolled through the cavern. The chains were moving. Slowly, Walter reached trembling fingers toward the old hull beside him. Tears glistened faintly in his pale eyes beneath the flashlight beam. "My father died trying to protect what was down there," he said softly. "Everyone believed he abandoned the crew for treasure. They called him greedy until the day he died." Ethan looked toward him carefully. "And the truth?" Walter swallowed hard as another wave surged into the cave entrance behind them. The ship was carrying relief bonds and payroll certificates after the war. Enough money to rebuild half the fishing towns along this coast. Briggs barked sharply again and pawed at the hatch. Ethan knelt beside it and brushed away years of hardened sand and salt. A symbol slowly emerged beneath his fingers. Not a company mark, not military. A lighthouse emblem carved into steel beside a single engraved phrase. "Return this to the forgotten." The cave fell silent except for the breathing ocean beyond the rocks. Then somewhere deep below the hatch came the unmistakable sound of something heavy unlocking beneath the sea. The sound beneath the hatch echoed through the cavern again, deeper this time, like ancient machinery stirring after decades beneath the sea. Ethan held the flashlight steady while seawater curled around his boots in slow, icy currents. Briggs stood rigid beside the steel hatch, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on the darkness below, as though something far beneath the wreck had finally answered the dog's call. Walter knelt carefully beside the corroded metal, his weathered fingers brushing across the lighthouse emblem carved into its surface. Water dripped steadily from the cave, sealing onto the old steel with hollow ticking sounds that seemed almost like a clock counting down somewhere beneath the ocean. "My father tried to tell them," Walter whispered. "But nobody listened." Ethan looked toward him. "Tell them what?" Walter stared into the darkness for several seconds before answering. The Morning Star was never carrying stolen money. It was carrying relief bonds meant for fishing towns destroyed after the war. Entire communities were waiting for that ship. His voice cracked softly beneath the cavern echoes. "When the storm hit, my father stayed behind trying to lock the cargo below deck so it would not scatter into the sea." Briggs lowered his head closer to the hatch and released a low whine. Ethan crouched beside him and noticed something shifting beneath the rusted chains. Water was draining downward through narrow gaps around the steel, as though the tide itself was pulling away from whatever rested below. Carefully, Ethan gripped the heavy wheel latch attached to the hatch. It resisted at first, frozen by salt and time. Then, with a grinding groan that echoed through the cavern walls, the mechanism finally moved. The chains rattled violently beneath the ship. Walter inhaled sharply. Ethan pulled harder. The steel hatch lifted several inches before seawater spilled away through the opening beneath it. Cold air rushed upward, carrying the scent of old timber, engine oil, and something metallic preserved in darkness for half a century. Briggs barked once and stepped backward as Ethan raised the hatch fully open. Beneath it, an iron ladder disappeared into a hidden compartment deep inside the wreck. Ethan swept the flashlight downward. The beam revealed rows of sealed steel crates stacked carefully below deck, untouched by the sea. Thick waterproof wax still coated the edges despite decades underwater. Walter's hands began trembling visibly. "Dear Lord," he whispered. Ethan climbed down first, boots echoing softly against the metal rungs. Briggs followed immediately behind him, without hesitation, while Walter descended more slowly into the hidden chamber. The air below felt strangely preserved, cold but dry enough for dust to cling to the corners of the room. Old lantern hooks still hung from the ceiling beams, and faded shipping manifests remained pinned against one wall beneath layers of age. Ethan moved the flashlight carefully across the crates until one marking caught his eye. United States Coastal Recovery Fund. Another crate carried military insignia partially faded by time. Beside it rested several waterproof leather satchels sealed with brass locks. Walter stared at them in disbelief. "Those were payroll certificates," he said softly. "Families waited months for those checks after the war." Ethan knelt and carefully opened one satchel. Inside rested bundles of government bonds wrapped tightly in waxed paper, still preserved after 50 years beneath the ocean. But it was not the money that caught Ethan's attention. Beneath the documents rested a leather journal with Walter Quinn Sr. embossed across the cover. Walter's breathing became uneven as Ethan handed it to him. The old fisherman opened the journal slowly beneath the flashlight beam. The first pages described the storm the night the Morning Star vanished. Crew names, coordinates, cargo lists. But farther inside, Ethan noticed another entry written shakily across several pages. "If this ship is ever found, tell Stormhaven the truth. I stayed because the cargo belonged to families already broken by war. No fortune is worth more than people trying to rebuild their lives." Walter closed his eyes tightly for a moment while seawater echoed softly against the hull around them. "They called him a thief," he whispered. "For 50 years this town believed my father sank the ship trying to steal the cargo." Briggs suddenly moved toward the far end of the hidden compartment where another smaller door rested half concealed behind stacked crates. The dog sniffed carefully at the rusted handle before placing one paw against it. Ethan stepped closer and slowly pulled the door open. Behind it stood a narrow room untouched by water. Inside rested shelves lined with old photographs, rescue maps, and dozens of carefully labeled envelopes addressed to families throughout the New England coast. At the center of the room stood a lighthouse lantern polished bright despite the passing decades. Walter stared at it with tears shining in his pale blue eyes. "My father built this room himself," he whispered. "He believed someday the sea would return everything to the people it belonged to." Above them, somewhere beyond the cavern roof, the lighthouse beacon suddenly flickered alive once more through the fog. The lighthouse beam swept slowly across the fog for the first time in decades, its pale glow cutting through the gray morning like a memory returning to life. Ethan stood near the hidden chamber beneath the wreck, while seawater whispered softly against the hull around them. The light above flickered through cracks in the cavern ceiling, casting moving shadows across the preserved cargo and weathered photographs lining the walls. Briggs sat quietly beside the old lantern at the center of the room, his amber eyes reflecting the glow with strange stillness. Walter remained frozen near the shelves, one trembling hand pressed against his father's journal, as though afraid the truth itself might disappear if he let go. For several long moments, none of them spoke. The ocean filled the silence instead. Slow waves rolled through the cave entrance, carrying the deep, endless breath of the Atlantic into the hidden room beneath the cliffs. Ethan moved carefully through the chamber, studying the envelopes stacked neatly across the shelves. Every one carried a handwritten name and address. Fishing families from Maine. Widow pension accounts from Rhode Island. Relief funds meant for towns destroyed by storms and poverty after the war. Decades of forgotten promises preserved beneath the sea. He organized all of it before the ship went down, Ethan said quietly. Walter nodded slowly, tears shining beneath the flashlight beam. "My father knew the storm was going to destroy the ship." His voice shook softly against the cavern walls. "So he locked everything here before the reef tore the hull apart." Briggs suddenly lifted his head toward the cave entrance. The dog's ears twitched once, listening toward distant sounds above the cliffs. Ethan heard them seconds later. Voices, faint at first beneath the wind and surf, but growing louder through the fog. Walter looked toward the entrance in alarm. People from town. Ethan frowned slightly. How would they know? Walter gave a weak smile touched with sadness. In Stormhaven, lights that return from the dead do not stay secret very long. By the time they climbed back through the hidden hatch, the fog outside had begun lifting from the shoreline. Pale afternoon lights spread across the exposed reef, while several townspeople gathered cautiously near the cave entrance below the cliffs. Fishermen in heavy wool coats. Harbor workers. Old women wrapped in rain shawls. Even Sheriff Dalton stood among them staring toward the cavern with stunned disbelief. Briggs emerged first from the cave, calm and watchful as the crowd fell silent at the sight of him. Then Ethan climbed out beside Walter carrying the old journal beneath his arm. Nobody spoke at first. The only sound came from gulls circling overhead and the distant lighthouse beacon turning slowly against the clouds. Finally, Sheriff Dalton stepped forward. His weathered face had gone pale beneath the cold wind. "Walter," he said carefully, "tell me that is not what I think it is." Walter looked back toward the hidden wreck beneath the cliffs before answering. "It is the Morning Star." A stunned silence spread across the shoreline. Several older fishermen removed their caps quietly as though standing before a grave finally found after half a century. Ethan handed the journal to the sheriff. Dalton opened it slowly while the wind tugged at the pages. The expressions across the crowd shifted as he read aloud portions of Walter Quinn Sr.'s final entries. The rescue accounts, the preserved bonds, the decision to protect the relief cargo instead of abandoning it during the storm. By the time Dalton lowered the journal, many in the crowd stood speechless beneath the gray sky. One elderly woman near the cliffs wiped tears from her eyes. "My father used to say Walter's family stole from this town," she whispered softly. Walter stared out toward the ocean without bitterness. "Most people only remembered the ship disappearing," he said. "Nobody remembered why my father stayed behind." Briggs moved quietly beside Walter and rested his head gently against the old fisherman's hand. The simple gesture seemed to break something loose inside the gathered crowd. One by one, the townspeople stepped closer, not with suspicion anymore, but with reverence, understanding. A lifetime of blame slowly washed away by truth rising from beneath the sea. Above them, the lighthouse beacon continued turning through the afternoon mist, its pale light sweeping across Stormhaven once more. And for the first time in 50 years, the ocean had finally returned the name of an honest man. 3 weeks later, winter's sunlight spilled softly across the harbor of Stormhaven, turning the ocean into sheets of silver-blue glass beneath the morning sky. The storms had finally passed, leaving the coastline washed clean and quiet in a way Ethan had never seen before. Fishing boats drifted calmly near the docks while gulls wheeled lazily above the water, their cries carrying through the cold sea air like old songs returning home. The lighthouse above the cliffs stood bright against the horizon once more, its restored beacon turning slowly day and night after sitting dark for nearly half a century. People from town had rebuilt the old electrical lines together after the discovery beneath the reef, and now every evening the light swept across the Atlantic again, guiding ships safely through the fog exactly as it had generations earlier. Ethan stood outside the cottage repairing one of the weathered lobster crates stacked beside the porch. The scent of cedar shavings mixed with salt air while waves rolled gently against the rocks below. Briggs rested nearby beneath the pale winter sun, head lifted toward the sea, calm now in a way Ethan had not seen in years. Since the wreck had been found, the dog no longer paced the shoreline at night listening for hidden sounds beneath the tide. Whatever call had once echoed through the ocean seemed finally answered. Walter Quinn sat wrapped in a heavy wool blanket near the porch railing overlooking the harbor. The old fisherman looked thinner these days, more fragile beneath the cold wind, yet there was peace in his face now where sorrow had once settled for decades. The town no longer looked at him with suspicion or whispered stories when he passed through the market. Children waved at him from the docks. Fishermen tipped their caps when he walked near the marina. Even the harbor memorial had been changed. A new bronze plaque now rested beside the lighthouse path carrying the names of the Morning Star crew along with a final inscription beneath them. They stayed so others could rebuild. Walter stared at the plaque for a long time the first morning it was unveiled. He had cried quietly while Briggs rested beside him in the snow. Ethan finished repairing the crate and looked toward the harbor where volunteers carefully unloaded preserved cargo recovered from the hidden chamber beneath the reef. Much of the relief money had been distributed to surviving descendants of the original fishing families. The rest funded repairs across Stormhaven, rebuilding old docks, helping widows, restoring homes weathered by decades of storms and hardship. The fortune hidden beneath the sea had returned not as greed or riches, but as healing. Walter noticed Ethan watching the harbor. "Funny thing about the ocean," he said softly. "People think treasure means gold." Ethan leaned against the porch railing beside him. "What do you think it means?" Walter smiled faintly toward the waves below. "Second chances." The wind carried the distant ringing of harbor bells through the sunlight. Briggs suddenly stood and walked toward the edge of the cliffs overlooking the water. Ethan followed him with his eyes. Far below, gentle waves rolled across the rocks where the hidden cave now rested, sealed once more beneath the tide. The sea had reclaimed the wreck after the cargo and records were recovered, covering the entrance beneath water as quietly as it had hidden it all those years before. Walter watched Briggs carefully. "He knew before any of us," the old man whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. "He usually does." Silence settled comfortably between them while sunlight shimmered across the Atlantic. For the first time in a long while, Ethan no longer felt like a man drifting between places. Stormhaven had begun to feel less like somewhere he stopped and more like somewhere he belonged. Walter reached into his coat pocket and carefully handed Ethan a small brass key attached to a weathered lighthouse token.